All right. Hello and welcome. Lovely to see all of your faces, although I am blinded at this time, on a brisk, shall we say, January evening. Really, really wonderful to have you here, and very, very exciting to have Glenn Adamson here. Welcome to Cranbrook Art Museum. My name is Lila Catelier. I'm the curator of public programs here. I'm going to keep my introduction extremely brief so we can get to this really, really exciting conversation. Toshiko Takaezu is, of course, one of our darling loves, and it's been so, so wonderful over the last couple of years to sort of work towards this moment where this major celebration of Toshiko's work could be sort of back at home. Of course, she has many homes, but this is sort of our home for her. So we're so excited to really celebrate Takaezu in the way that she deserves to be celebrated, with a sort of national tour of 5 different major institutions. So this show originated at the Noguchi Museum with co-curators Leila Hualanzaladi, whose film we've just seen a portion of. Our Hands in the Sky is a film that's included in the exhibition by Leila Hua, which is sort of imagery and inspiration from Hawaii, which is a sort of homeland that they share. And it's a really, really wonderful experience. So I do want to encourage all of you to spend 45 minutes in the Artist Lounge sometime in the next 4 days. To watch that entire film before it closes on the 12th. I also want to thank Kate Weiner, the third curator on this exhibition from the Noguchi Museum. It was a wonderful collaboration. And then, of course, Glenn Adamson, who's here tonight to speak with us. Many of you have A Century of Tomorrow, Glenn Adamson's brand new book, hot off the presses. We will not be discussing that tonight, but maybe you can encourage him to say a little bit about that during the Q&A. Glenn is the artistic director of Design Doha, which is a biennial in Qatar. He's the curator at large for Vitra Design Museum, and he's the editor of Material Intelligence, a quarterly online journal published by the Chipstone Foundation. And tonight, he is our guest scholar. He'll be joined in conversation by Laura Mott, our chief curator, and Ian McDonald, our head artist in residence for the ceramic department. And so honestly, without further ado, let's just get into it. Please join me in welcoming Glenn.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be back at Cranbrook. So many friends in the room. Thank you for coming out on a cold night. And a big thank you to Lila for your great hospitality, and also to Laura Mott for curating the show so beautifully and installing it so beautifully. Andrew Blauvelt, the director here, and the whole team at the Cranbrook Art Museum can think of no better hands to place this wonderful work into. And you've done such an incredible job with this project that Kate and the rest of the team at the Noguchi Museum and I were able to create. I received a lot of compliments about the show, both in New York and here, and I have to say that it's 95% Toshiko Takaezu and nothing that we can take credit for ourselves. She is an absolutely astonishing artist to have had the privilege and honor to work with, obviously posthumously, but nonetheless very much imbued by her spirit. So every one of those objects upstairs, you feel like you're connecting with her in a very deep sense. What I'm going to try to do just for about 30 minutes, prefatory remarks before we get into a conversation with Ian and Laura, is to give you some sense of her biography and the contours of her career, just in case you're not familiar, and also give you some sense of why her work matters so much and the philosophical implications of it, if I could put it that way. Sounds a bit pretentious maybe, but I think it entirely warranted. So if you know any of Takaezu's work already, it would be these objects, which she called closed forms. Very interesting terminology because it implies a kind of relationship with modernist abstraction, the word form as opposed to pot, or even perhaps the word sculpture. This sense of a kind of release from functional pottery was, of course, very important, both specifically in her case and also generally in post-war ceramics. We might also think about people like Peter Volkas, John Mason, and then lots of people who came through Cranbrook, which I'll get back to in a moment. So the closure of the object at the top signals a refusal of utilitarian purpose and therefore a kind of launch into some other trajectory, which when she first started doing this was, of course, still to be mapped. And she was the person on the East Coast, at any rate, once she ultimately moved to New Jersey, who really became the standard bearer for that new approach to the medium. But there are many other ways of thinking about Takaezu beyond this refusal of function and this departure from the utilitarian into the abstract or the sculptural, which I think it's fair to say is how she was generally talked about before we came along to do this project. What we wanted to do was think about the many other registers of meaning and creativity that Takaezu embodied. And I'll just go through a few of them, as I say in these remarks. Perhaps the most subtle and intriguing, and the one that ultimately became most interesting to us, arguably through the course of doing the show, is the activation that she bestowed upon these objects by making them kinetic and making them essentially into musical instruments. And this is really what motivated us to invite Leilahua Lanzalotti, our third curator, to work with us and make film support for the show. She's a composer, also from Hawaii, as Lila said, and so there was a really great sort of kindred spirit connection between them as well. But this introduction of the rattle into the closed form actually began completely by mistake. Takaezu apparently was closing one of these objects at the top, and as you can imagine, that's quite a tricky maneuver because she's not really leaving any room for her own fingers, and she's ultimately allowing the clay to almost touch at the apex of the object, leaving just a tiny vent for the air to escape. Any of you who are ceramic artists will immediately appreciate if it were completely sealed, then the object would explode in the kiln. So it needs to have this very, very tiny, very perfectly formed aperture at the top. And while she was executing that maneuver at some point in the 60s, a little bit of clay fell in, and then magically, as if in a gift from the kiln gods, did not fuse to the interior vessel wall. So when she picked it up after firing it, it made a sound. And she immediately thought, this is something I have to commit myself to artistically. And she experimented thereafter with various numbers, quantity, and also size and shape of bead or rattle that she would put inside, wrapping them in paper to make sure that they wouldn't fuse to the interior wall, and thereby introduced this whole other aspect of her work, which is kind of secret, because not only do you not see it, obviously, because it's hidden inside, but when the object is on view in a museum, you don't necessarily even know that it's there. So it's like a gift to an owner or somebody who has a more intimate relationship to the piece. She also apparently, we don't know much about this actually, but she apparently sometimes inscribed the interior of these objects with a character in Japanese. Possibly even a whole poetic stanza, like a haiku. And as I say, we don't know much about this because we're not about to go around breaking her objects to see if they have writing inside them. But this idea of something that is for the gods or for the object itself, or at any rate withheld, is very, very powerful in her practice. And I think one thing that you could say in general about her work is that it expresses a very potent interiority, by which I mean that as beautiful and luxuriant as her painting of the exterior of these closed forms is, there's also a suggestion of a world within, this is the title for the show, that one can't access except through the imagination. And that invitation to transport yourself mentally and philosophically into the interior of the form is, you could say, a metaphor for our attempt to know one another and relate to one another, because as I look at all of you wonderful people out here, I can see your exterior, but I can't get inside you, and maybe you can't even fully get inside yourself unless you're involved in extensive Freudian psychotherapy. So this relationship between the exterior and the interior, which of course is absolutely intrinsic to ceramic history. It's always an issue that potters think about when they're making vases, bowls, etc. It's something she transmutes into an abstract dynamic in the form. And as I'll get back to in a minute, the way that she then approaches mark making, color, palette on the exterior complicates that further. But a good way of thinking about how we're repositioning her in this aspect of her work would be to compare her closed forms to an object like this one, which is called With Hidden Noise. and it's a ready-made sculpture, if that's the word, by Marcel Duchamp, where he's hidden an object inside this ball of twine and given you no access to that content, and thereby made that invisible, unknown thing powerful, almost like a kind of relic. You also see this in African sculpture, this idea of effacing as a way of empowering. And Takaezu's participating in this kind of artistic strategy in a way that I think people hadn't really appreciated before, and something we were very keen to draw out in the show. So that just gives you one example of the complexity of her work, and I'll try to touch on a few other valences of it in a moment. But first, a little bit about her biography. So here she is as a young person. She was born in Hawaii, as Lila said, to parents who had themselves immigrated from Okinawa. So they were part of a very large group of expatriates or migrants who came as manual laborers, as agricultural workers to Hawaii in the beginning of the 20th century. This was actually a program that was very aggressively promoted by the Japanese government, incidentally, and you can already start to detect the influence of racist bureaucratic processes in her biography even before she's born, because you could say that the treatment of the Okinawan population by the Japanese at the early 20th century already bears this kind of asymmetrical power relation. And of course, as an Asian American, she would be experiencing her own versions of that throughout her life. She's from a very large family, as you can see here, and she's the middle child of 9. She called herself the navel child, as in belly button. And this idea of her being in the center, I, in fact, titled my essays in the book centering Toshiko Takaezu, because this idea that she's standing astride the apex, the axis mundi in some way, like the center of things, I think is a very important aspect of her self-conception. And of course, it has to do with throwing on the wheel and the sense of centrifugal and centripetal forces that are always present in ceramics, which she fully masters. But at any rate, she's there on the left, fourth from the left in the white knee socks. So there she is at probably age, she's 5, because she was born in 1922. Then something really surprising happens. Because, of course, 99 times out of 100, she would have had a life of basically working class agricultural, agricultural biography. But she made a very bold and surprising decision to drop out of high school to go and earn money for her parents during the Depression, when things were very tough for them. And she went from Maui to Honolulu and took on a job as a domestic servant, a maid, effectively. And by wild chance, the people that she ended up working for owned a pottery. In fact, they owned the first pottery in Hawaii and had to go and figure out where they could dig clay locally in order to make these objects and sell them to tourists. And so she started to work with the medium for the first time, obviously had a real affinity for it. Her very first objects, as we can see in these snapshots, which, like a lot of the photos I'm showing you, are from the Archives of American Art, which holds her papers now, were conventional or traditional sculptures. So she's really just getting her hands dirty and understanding what she can do with this plastic material. But she very quickly becomes skillful. She goes and teaches at the YWCA in Honolulu. So you can see her there on the left. So she's now in her early 20s. And then she crucially is able to go and attend to get an actual degree, an art degree at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, in this new program that's run by a fascinating character called Claude Horan, who, love the Hawaiian shirts, by the way. He's the guy from second on the left, and he's a sort of unheralded figure outside of Hawaii, but he was doing something sort of like what Peter Voulkos was doing in California, if you know that story. So introducing this kind of avant-gardism and progressive conception of what the medium could do with his students, many of whom were of Japanese extraction, like Takaezu herself. And while she's at the University of Hawaii, she sees a magazine that talks about Maya Grotel, who, of course, is the great teacher and maker from Cranbrook. And so she decides that she's going to go by plane and train and bus from Hawaii, which she's never left in her life, to the frozen Midwest right here. And it's so amazing to be here talking about this. And so here she is right early onset Cranbrook here. So this is her right as she's arrived. And as you can see, she's still experimenting in a whole range of different directions. But the reason that she came was because of Grotel herself. Not really because of Cranbrook, just because of this one woman who, as you probably know, was from Finland and was by far the most significant and most skilled modernist ceramic artist in the United States at this time, by which I mean the 1940s and 50s. So Takaezu arrives in 1951, gets her degree in 54 from Cranbrook. Grotel was famously taciturn and withholding as a teacher, so she wouldn't really say anything to you most of the time, and she would occasionally make a sort of seemingly offhand remark that as a student you would then meditate on for weeks and think about what you should do about it. One thing that she did say to Takaezu, these is just a couple of her magisterial works, Grotel's works, just to give you, to remind you of how powerful she was as a maker in her own right. It might just be worth saying, by the way, that until Grotel came to Cranbrook, there wasn't really anyone teaching. This is hard to believe, but there wasn't anyone really teaching, at least for most of America, that actually knew how to throw on the wheel, at least not well, because the way that ceramics were made in the early 20th century in most cases, which was to say in an industrial context, was to be subtractively modeled using calipers, so you'd be scraping away a molded ceramic rather than throwing this beautiful volume on the wheel with its own kind of life and rhythm. And the way that Grotel often approached her work, and you can really see this well in the example on the right, which is at the Metropolitan Collection, is to accentuate that sense of rhythm, almost like tidal lines across the curvature of the object. So at any rate, you can see why Takaezu was impressed and the reason that she wanted to come and apprentice herself to this person. But when Takaezu started making works like this one, which you could see as being relatively influenced by Grotel, Maya Grotel said to her, effectively, don't do that. You need to find your own voice. And Takaezu sort of received that message and then set about trying to figure that out. So Laura wrote a beautiful essay in the book about her years here at Cranbrook, and that's more than I can get into here, really worth reading that. But suffice to say that by the time she finished her degree here in 1954, she really still hadn't figured that out. So she didn't really know where she was going artistically. And in fact, she had a kind of crisis as to whether she should continue as an artist. And I think one of the things that was bound up in that moment was whether she was going to be an artist or whether she was going to be a wife and a mother. And it's hard for us to accept that that was a choice that people felt like they had to make in the 1950s, but certainly she felt that way. And I guess she probably would have been thinking about her own mother and her sisters as models. She had several sisters who were at this time getting married or already were. And she, I think, took it for granted that if she were going to be a serious artist, she would be alone. And ultimately, that is what she decided to do. In fact, never did marry or even have a really sustained romantic relationship, as far as we know. So this kind of almost self-assigned monastic existence that she associated with the very possibility of being a creative woman operating in the arts, even in the context of ceramics, which is, of course, relatively open to women, as Grotel's example suggests. So she was at a real crossroads. And then the opportunity came up for her to go to Japan with her sister and her mother. So this is 1955, 1956. She's over there for about 9 months. And again, great essay in the book about this by two curators at the MFA Boston that really tracks this whole experience that she had. Most remarkably, she met with this artist who's called Kagi Yasuo, who was the leader of a group called Sodeisha, which means the Crawling Through Mud Association. I'm not sure how you can say Crawling Through Mud Association in 3 syllables, but I don't speak Japanese. But he's doing, I've mentioned Volkas a few times, but that's partly because Volkas was such an important role model for Takaezu. He's doing for Japanese ceramics roughly what Volkas is about to do for American ceramics, which is to say to kind of blow it apart and deconstruct it and think about it as a completely abstract expressive medium. And amazingly, this photograph on the left is a slide that Takaezu herself took probably in early 1956, when these ceramics were just pulled out of the kiln. And that object on the right is called Direction of the Wind, and it's now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And until we found this in the archive in Washington, digitized Takaezu's slides, nobody had ever seen any images of this work when it was new. And in fact, some of these other objects aren't known otherwise. And it's wonderful to think about this encounter that these two avant-gardists had with one another right in the middle of the 1950s. So partly on the strength of this exposure to not just the avant-garde side of Japanese ceramics, but also the traditional side, and also Native American ceramics that she's encountering, she decides that she is in fact going to commit to this discipline and to this career. She gets first a short-term teaching gig in Madison, Wisconsin, and then a permanent job at Cleveland, at the Art Institute there. And that's when she really settles into her first experimental period and her most experimental period. So the 8 years that she's in Cleveland, which is 56 to 64, she's just riffing and experimenting almost like a jazz musician working in clay, just extraordinary, exciting objects, always using the known skill set of the discipline, which is to say throwing, which she's by now already mastered completely, and even forms like spouts, bodies and so on. But you can see that she's also playing with angles and reorientation. So these are all thrown elements, but they're put together kind of higgledy-piggledy in a very unconventional set of vectors. Stacking up these lobed forms that she called tamarinds, a very good example of the way that she borrows some of her forms and vocabulary from nature, and then crucially developing the closed form. And this, I think, is my favorite Takaezu object, which is a really hard thing to say, but it's an absolutely astonishing small piece that's in the collection of the Detroit Institute of Arts here, actually, so it lives in town. And, it's kind of everything at once. It reminds me a lot of those Zen paintings that where the brush is used to describe a circle, but it's anything but circular. It's this incredible, gestural, unexpected, alive mark. And she's done that actually in a couple of different strokes with glaze on the surface of the pot. It might be worth saying, by the way, that she was not particularly impressed by Zen herself. She did go and stay in a Zen monastery, and she thought most of the people there didn't really know what they were talking about. And she was a very, very pragmatic cast of mind. So she was the last person that was going to while away her life in idle meditation, right? So she was a worker. And in fact, she apparently said to her sister after they were in the monastery that the most Zen person that they knew was their mother, who had raised 9 kids on a farm, right? But at any rate, as I said earlier, the interiority of the object is obviously extremely powerful. And here you see her reaching towards the closed form. She's still articulating the top in what she called a mask pot form, because if you looked at it from above, it would look like a face. But what she's now doing, as you can see here in the early 60s, is to also think about the exterior of the pot as having this kind of infinite depth and a kind of void that is, of course, inside the pot, that dark air that you can't see inside, as she would describe it, but that's evoked in some way by the infinite effect of the painterly treatment of the surface, something she's absolutely getting from contemporaneous avant-garde painting, action painting, or abstract expressionism, as it was often called at the time by some. But it's not really abstract expressionism, at least not only, partly because it's obviously inspired by East Asian ink painting just as much as American New York school painting, but also because it's in the round. And so it has a totally different compositional dynamic than a rectangular painting would have. So instead of thinking about corners and centrality, she's thinking about a kind of spinning continuity that's maybe more similar to the way that a scroll painting works. That those scroll paintings that you can unroll and unroll and unroll and have this kind of temporal quality. Paintings that you can't see all of at once because, as you know, probably you look at about 2 feet worth of a scroll and then you kind of move along it almost in a cinematic way. And similarly with a pot, you're walking around it. And I really encourage you to do that upstairs. Spend time with these objects and orbit them and allow yourself to experience them in time, because that's how she would have understood them. She's also, important to say, working a lot in textiles, particularly in this early part of her career. My co-curator Kate wrote about this in the exhibition catalog. I didn't mention another really key figure for her at Cranbrook, who is Marianne Strengel, another Finnish. Obviously, you had a lot of Finns here, so she's another one of them, along with the Saarinens. And she would have taught Takaezu the Ria technique, which is very thick pile weaving technique. And as you can see, Takaezu was interested in working in that technique very large scale. And again, this kind of immersive color field approach that you might associate with someone like Helen Frankenthaler or Morris Lewis at this same date. Another thing that happens at this crucial moment in the late 50s, 1957, is that she meets Lenore Tawney, who is the only other artist whose work is included in the show here. Barbara Tober in the front row is nodding because she knew Lenore Tawney quite well. And Tawney is the most significant, I would argue, the most significant person in the history of American fiber art. She's really the breakthrough figure in that sphere. Just very briefly, her biography is that she's from Illinois. She goes to the new Bauhaus in Chicago after her husband dies and, in a way, frees her to pursue her artistic career. She falls in with this group in Coenties Slip, which includes people like Robert Indiana, who you see on the right, Ellsworth Kelly, Agnes Martin, who you see here, dressed up warm because they all lived in cold water flats in the old warehouses. And Tawney and Martin forged this extremely powerful spiritual and artistic connection, which has a lot to do with Tawney's eventual departure and her own departure into abstraction and what she calls woven forms. So there's a very strong correlation there between Takaezu's closed forms and Tawney's diaphanous open weave woven forms. And she has this amazing show in 1963 at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts where she fills the gallery with all these extraordinary, differently conceived compositions in open fiber hanging in space instead of hung on the wall, as had been traditional with tapestry, of course. And this is right around the time that Takaezu is getting to know her well, and they become extremely close friends. They travel to Latin America together. Here they are in Guatemala, both using backstrap looms where you lean against the loom to provide tension. They are so close that ultimately, actually, Tawney ends up living in Takaezu's house in New Jersey for a few years in the late 1970s when Tawney's apartment is being renovated. Takaezu, who was younger than Tawney and always treated her as a kind of sensei or a kind of mentor figure or honored elder, might be a way of putting it. She actually painted the entire upper floor of her house white, every surface, because that's how Tawney liked it, and brought in a big loom and sort of gave her that, half of her house and sort of handed it over to Tawney and had her up in the attic as this kind of celestial presence. Very, very interesting. And it gives you a sense of the kind of power of that relationship. So it's incredible to have that major work of Tawney's right behind the moon forms of Takaezu. So in 1964-65, Takaezu makes the move from Cleveland to New Jersey. She feels she's taking up too much of her time and energy teaching, and she wants to commit herself to more of a full-time making career. She's doing, again, a lot of experimenting at this time, doing some hand-built forms that she sometimes calls hapai, which means pregnant in Hawaiian, indigenous Hawaiian. And there's a great example of this body of work in the show, which is on loan from Longhouse. That's really worth a look because it's very, very different from a lot of her other throne work in terms of its texture and the way that it sits in space. Also, at this time is when she develops, which is to say kind of late 60s, early 70s. This is when she invents her moon forms, which are probably her most celebrated and certainly her most expensive objects. I say that because one of these was auctioned last year for over $500,000, which was a bit of a shock. And a good reminder that when you curate a show, you should buy an example before you start. These are actually quite exceptional in their technique because she's making them not on the wheel, but actually in a mold. So she's basically slump molding the two halves and then joining them together in the middle, almost like a traditional Korean moon jar, if you're familiar with those. And what's so wonderful about them is, of course, they have no up or down. They're planetary, and they sort of spin in space. And she would often exploit that by having, as you can see here, the glaze traveling across the surface in multiple directions. Something she also did, by the way, in her paintings. This isn't the best example of that, although it's a very beautiful one, very atmospheric and very redolent of her Hawaiian homeland, which she remained very strongly connected to, partly because her family was there and she would often go back. But she would often do the same thing in her paintings of pouring the paint on them, again, very like Frankenthaler, but having the rivulets cross each over the other so that there's sort of no top, no bottom, no left, no right. And obviously these are the paintings of a ceramist who's thinking in a three-dimensional way, but dealing with a two-dimensional surface. And I think you really get the sense of how she's thinking across media when you start putting the weavings and the paintings and the ceramics together, as we get to see upstairs. She's also very involved in installation strategies increasingly in the 1970s, so she starts to become much more adventurous with scale. There's a group of sculptures that she calls Gaia, as in the Earth Goddess, Gaea, or Earth Mother, which came about, again, rather by accident, sort of like the Rattles. She had a student, or an apprentice, who had brought some hammocks from Honduras back with him, and they were using them to dry these moons. And on a certain day, she looked at them kind of hanging there, these extremely heavy objects floating in this very light sling, and thought that was enough to be an artwork in its own right. And so she started installing them that way, and you'll see two of them upstairs. Incredible exercise in mass, and again, this kind of play of lightness and heaviness, and also, I think, a really great evocation or expression of the vulnerability of clay, because you have this super heavy, apparently very strong, obdurate sphere that, of course, if it were allowed to drop, would shatter and become archaeological, if you know what I mean. And the fact that these things are being held in space and are rather like planets, again, this kind of orbital effect that she's so good at creating, gives you this kind of, like heart skips a beat kind of moment when you encounter them. Also, I keep saying also because she's, as you can see, she's an inveterate, restless experimenter. In the late 70s, she starts working in bronze. And again, genius how she approaches this, because she treats bronze like she treats clay, not just in the sense that the bronzes are actually made from clay originals, because that's how she's developing the waxes. So she makes a clay form, creates a wax from it, and then creates the bronze in the traditional lost wax casting process. But also, when the object is at its wax stage, as you can see on the left, she pours liquid wax on it just in the same way that she would pour glaze on a ceramic object. And you get these very similar rivulets and kind of dynamic textures on the surface of these bronze objects. And then she would patinate them, which is a parallel to her glazing processes and something that she investigated deeply. Also, she makes bells, which are, again, among her most celebrated objects. There's one that's on permanent display in front of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, if you're ever there, and you can actually ring it if you like. Another one at Longhouse in East Hampton. And this, of course, relates to the kinetic, sonic elements of her closed forms. And then finally, last but not least, right at the end of her career, sort of like Titian and Monet, let's say, she scales up. So rather than, as her own body is failing and becoming weaker, she starts working bigger and bigger. In order to do this, she starts teaching and doing workshops up at Skidmore. I should have mentioned, by the way, she's teaching a lot at Princeton. It has a lot of students there, including Brooke Shields, by the way. But a lot of her students end up being apprentices in her studio. And if you've ever seen the film Karate Kid, do you remember that with Ralph Macchio, wax on, wax off? You remember that? She kind of treats them like that. So like very kind of tough love approach to remaking these young people who are, maybe 22 years old. And she kind of breaks them apart and rebuilds them. And the experience, maybe we even have somebody in the room who had this experience. Often that's the case when I lecture about Takaezu. So a lot of people went through this experience, and every one of them says it's the most important thing that ever happened to them practically. It was very devastating, inspiring, enlightening. transformative experience for people. But at any rate, with these young people, she's making these huge forms, and she talks about looking down into them, these abysses that she's making as she's making them, and feeling like she's going to fall in, and that the cosmos is inside the pot. So an amazing thing, she's been making these closed forms that you can kind of hug and hold in your hands for years, and now she's making them at such a scale that you can imagine diving into them and being inside them, being buried in them. So a kind of image of herself transcending or ascending or descending into another state after life, perhaps. So very profound objects again. And you'll see them in the last room of the exhibition, which it just looks so, Laura, it's unbelievable. It's got to be one of the best spaces in the world right now for aesthetic experience, and it's right upstairs. Just insane kind of level of resolution, and I just wish Takaezu were here to see it. But she makes these objects that were bigger than her, heavier than her, that stand there with these, again, ink painting-like marks on them, rivulets of gold coursing down their sides. She names them after stars, so again, emphasizing this celestial quality. But now you orbit around them because you're smaller than they are, so you're captured in their gravitational field. And they are her magnum opus. And then having made these, she starts giving her work away and very strategically places her work at museums all across the country. MFA Boston, Philadelphia, Art Institute of Chicago, LACMA here, and then she dies. And they stay there in storage for all these years. Some are displayed, most aren't. And then we come along and suddenly there they all are for us, and we make the show out of them, right? It's like we're just receiving the message, like tuning in a radio and letting her speak to us through these objects. And they've been all around the world already. So here they are at Crystal Bridges in the company of these amazing female abstract expressionists, Frankenthaler, Hartigan, Mitchell. Here at the MFA Boston, again with Joan Mitchell. Here at the Venice Biennale, this is not the last one, but the one before that, curated by Cecilia Alamane. And right around the corner was a Ruth Asawa wire hanging. And then, of course, at the Noguchi Museum and here. The last thing I want to say, and we'll get into this with Ian, is that in addition to the ongoing resonance and power of Takaezu's own work, I think it's absolutely impossible to understand contemporary ceramic art without grasping what she imparted to the present generation, just in the same way that we would say about Tawny and fiber art, which is all the rage right now. So just to give you one example, think about the work of Simone Lee, who is among our most celebrated, not just ceramic artists, but most celebrated artists, full stop. And think about the interiority, the gynomorphism, not anthropomorphism, but gynomorphism of her work. Think about the scale. Think about the sense of the mark, the hand, the issues of identity. Here, of course, African-American rather than Asian-American identity, but identity as expressed through this object that simultaneously expresses in this incredibly powerful way and is withheld, the effacing of the eyes, to me being very similar in some ways to the closure of the top of the closed form. If I were teaching a class about ceramic history, the exam I would give at the end of the course, and the essay question would be, compare this with a Takaezu closed form, right? You can see how much resonance there is there, and so many people, not just Simone Lee, hundreds of artists have learned from her example, and so it's been such a pleasure to be able to investigate that in depth and bring it to the general public. And of course, here at Cranbrook, we have the opportunity to engage with a whole other generation of artists, not just in the ceramics departments, but all the departments here. So it's really the perfect place, not just because it is a spiritual home for Takaezu, but because, and she would have been the first to say this, the legacy lives on through the hands of other makers and new generations. And here they are, you're sitting in the audience right now, listening and looking and learning from her. So that's what I'm going to say. And I would love to invite Laura and Ian up to the stage with me, and we will have questions from you after, but first we're going to have a little bit of a chat. Thank you. So I feel like we're under planet Takaezu here. It's like a moon landing, literally and figuratively. So Laura, Ian, Great to see you here. Laura, do you want to start by just giving your own personal response to having handled these objects and installed the show, maybe?
Yeah, I thought I would begin by sharing some reflections of my process of working with the show and working with Toshiko. One of the things that really resonated with me, spending time with the archives here and her story, is just how phenomenal it is. And this is a story that happens quite often, actually, and kind of reminded me of what a phenomenal place Cranbrook is that here's, Toshiko comes all the way from Hawaii here, and she is working under two women who are leading art departments. It's incredible in the 1950s. They have their own autonomy, they have their own income, they have their own careers, and she just makes this her life. She decides this is a life I'm gonna follow. And I find that to be so powerful. And then also this idea of hard work, like you could have talked about this monasticism, this dedication. When she has this opportunity, she's like, well, this means this is what I do. I work this hard to honor the opportunity that I've had in life. And I found that also to be the case with Olga Damerol. I did her retrospective a few years ago. And she had that same work ethic, but also this idea that you just don't stop. And with Olga, I would say for me, was some of the most exciting work she's been making in her 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's the same thing with these really large forms that Toshiko has, and that's the work she's making in her 70s. And like to all the artists out there and to everyone, I mean, make that your life. I mean, I've learned like true life lessons on how to live through like Olga, Ali McGee, who I did his retrospective as well, and Toshiko like really mirrored that for me. It's a good reminder of just how to live a life.
Yeah, I mean, to me, in a way, the reason that we come to art is to get the measure of the full dimensions of human possibility.
Yeah.
And of course, some artists do that one object at a time. I feel like Takaezu did that at the end of her career with the Star series, arguably, and those other monumental closed forms. But you could maybe say that she's doing it through the totality of her work. And I guess one question I would have, just following up, Laura, is how you think about the multiplicity and the kind of seriality of her work. We tend to think of her more as akin to minimalism, to abstract expressionism, but there's also a kind of quasi-minimalistic reductivism and certainly the repetition of her work, which is sort of the repetition of a studio potter, but it's also the repetition of an abstractionist and her return over and over again to these same forms or similar forms, spheres, ovoids, and I suppose you could say, well, painters just keep making rectangles, and it's not really that different. But I think it has been very striking to people how unswerving she is in her address of this same typology. I wonder what you make of that.
Well, it's interesting, because one of the things that it's a little bit of a different answer, but one of the things that was interesting for me, the Noguchi exhibition was not chronological. I've done like a very kind of loose chronology upstairs because I wanted to start with Cranbrook and I wanted to end with the large monumental forms at the end of her life. But I think there's another thread to look through beyond just the forms themselves, but her painting practice. You can see at the very beginning her kind of experimenting with the surfaces of her forms, and then you can kind of follow that too. When I get to the Star series, that's like mastery in terms of that relationship of the glaze, the fire, and that the abstraction. Almost the idea too that we had mentioned this and talked about this before, that she was also creating at that scale because she wanted a larger canvas. And so for me, it's about, you can see this seriality, but also I see a progression as a painter when you go from the beginning to the end.
That's right. So the reason she's making objects that are larger than her is so she can do that Franz Klein, Joan Mitchell thing of the full gesture of the body, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is also something you see in large-scale calligraphy at this date in East Asia, and she would have known that. Ian, do you want to talk about your own kind of perspective on this, both a maker as yourself and also a teacher, how the students are responding to the show?
Sure. I mean, it's a lot to take on there all of a sudden, it seems like. In terms of, in particular, in terms of I was really struck by this idea that, in seeing the images just now, that if you think about Cranbrook and the way that I think about the ceramics program, we talk about it a lot, is that we spent a lot of time in the studio. So this is where the learning takes place. So if you think about all that work up there and the serial nature of it, it's this idea that you're trying to bring your own work into dialogue with itself in order to learn something from it. And this is a very ceramic thing. And one thing we talk about a lot is that the process can be meaningful if you are attuned to it and aware of it. So, we also want to be kind of efficient with ceramics in a way. We don't often make one thing at a time. It's not an efficient way of working to stand over it and kind of stare at it. Although some of us do that. But at the same time, so there's this kind of making in batches and learning in batches, and so I can really see that up in that exhibition, that there's this kind of ways of working through ideas that then spin into something else and move on to another one, and that's through dedicated studio practice and studio time. And so I was really struck by that, and also this idea really of seeing the different materials in action. Again, something we talk about, something I think about within my own practice a lot, is that ceramics is a very specific material, and it operates in a very specific way. And one way to bring those two things into contrast is to put them in conversation with one another. And so seeing those, all that work together from other artists as well as the paintings and things like that, really brought a lot of it together for me. So there was kind of a big learning for me in that way.
Ian, can I ask you about, 'cause I understand this intellectually, but I don't understand it from a maker's point of view, the question of what painting is like for a ceramic artist. And in fact, I did a show with Takaezu's work, among others, that was called Painting in the Dark at James Cohan Gallery a couple of years ago, which was a phrase I had gotten from a potter who pointed out that glazing an object was like painting in the dark, because when you put the glazes on the object, they're all beige, basically, and then they become this. And so you're having to imagine what the effect of not just the one glaze will be, but also their interaction, and she's so masterful at that. So I'd love to hear you talk about that kind of interior mentality as applied to the process of painting rather than the immediate gratification that a oil painter or an acrylic painter would have, and also what you see in terms of interaction of glaze and slip materials on her surfaces.
Yeah, I mean, having not had the conversation, but I mean, with her, but the idea for me has a lot to do with it's very experiential. Yeah. So we often talk about this in the studios too. It's like, well, what if I did this, or what if I did that? And it's like, well, we can find out. There is a way we can find out, and so let's just try it. And so we do a lot of this moving things through to see, right. And it is a very there is a lot of ways that potters have thought about this that might be different from painters in terms of being also thinking through the economy of materials. So you could have a black and a white glaze, and with those two glazes you could have 4 effects, one each individual, and then layering them back and forth on top of one another. So you have 4 effects. So there's different ways that you can just experiment with, and you just mentioned this a second ago with the serial nature of some of the work. There's ways to experiment with limited activity, and then you can widen the lens from there. Right. And there's a lot of glazing going on upstairs in those pieces. So I think there's a lot of layering over the top of one another. There's background color, which painters think about a lot in terms of what you start with and the underpainting. So I think there's a lot going there. I think I'm meandering off your point a little bit, but I think in some ways it has a lot to do with the experience. And so within my own work, there is a lot of time still, and I think it's in the essay you wrote for Painting in the Dark, which is there's still the moment of like opening the kiln, and most ceramicists know this. There's a moment where you're kind of like, you're excited, and you're kind of, there's moments of dread in there. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening in your mind as you open it up, because even though you think you know, you don't know. And you sort of have a hypothesis,
Yeah, I know Takaezu would often talk about and I think other potters say similar things, that when you bisque fire the work, it dies, and then you glaze it and you bring it back to life. So it's this kind of phoenix from the ashes, or savior rising from the dead kind of dynamic.
I skip bisque.
You skip bisque. You don't want to see it. Yeah. And a lot of ceramic artists, I think, don't do that, because you get it's more unpredictable perhaps, but it's also, less, I don't know, there's like a sexiness of the kind of fleshly quality and the liquidity that you lose when you bisque fire yes.
Well, that's when you turn it into an actual clay ceramic. That before that, it's not ceramic; it's
Right.
mud,
Clay, yeah.
and so it becomes ceramic when it goes through that process. It becomes a material through the process of firing, and so it becomes available for glazing to happen. I mean, these are all a little bit more they're more conventions around process, but bisque is not my favorite phase.
You know, the related topic, I'd love to get both of your takes on this, which is the question of chance operations. So I mentioned Duchamp, who is, a granddaddy figure in so many ways, for better or worse, and one way is chance operations. So in other words, the intentional use of what fancy people call aleatory aesthetics, but I'm just going to call randomness, and accident in making a form. And this, of course, is another thing you see a lot in ceramics in general, but it seems to me like Takaezu is a really intense example of chance as applied to form, and I wonder how you look at that and where you would put her in relation to other maybe chance operations artists.
Other chance operations artists. I mean, I will share a process that I had in curating the show, and it's quite sweet. The rattle. We don't know what's going to rattle, and so it was such like a joyous experience to be able to. We're moving things around, and it became these little gifts, these little surprises. Everything you're kind of talking about in terms of process, it continues on. So just, I wanted to share that because as you were talking about the rattling earlier, like you just don't know, it becomes a very intimate thing. And then when you have so many of her works upstairs that they don't let me touch anything. But when we were installing the show, we kind of got to make our own little orchestra of that installation, which was quite special. In terms of the randomness, I mean, I have a lot to think about with your Duchamp example and some of the other things that you were speaking about. I would say that there's a physicality that I experienced with curating the show that reminds me of dance, or there's almost a dance that you do, especially when you're moving those large forms. You can't really move them very much, and so I'm dipping and diving and moving really quick, seeing everything from an angle, and so there's something there almost about, you talk about randomness, but also the jazz kind of way of the creation of them became my experience actually physically curating the show. I love the way that I was listening and moving around the work.
I love the idea of art installation as like a piece of choreography that lasts a week, like really slow dance.
Yeah.
And then it just stops, like you take in a photograph and that's it, until deinstallation when the dance starts again backwards, like reversing the film. That's really nice.
I was just going to say, I think one of those pieces, I wouldn't really know exactly, but one of the moon forms, it appears to me as though it was fired upside down and then rolled to its other side.
That's right.
For its final presentation. So in a way, that's also a chance operation, because you've done it in a particular orientation, and you've had to make it in a particular way. And this is, again, being attuned to process as being meaningful. You make it in a particular way. But then you have to go through these different stages in order to accomplish the final result. And in the end, you end up somehow maybe rolling it over and going, oh, that's the way. That makes sense. And then you kind of build off that again.
Yeah.
So there's, I thought that was kind of an interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So all these different aspects of chance, of course, the rattles, you sort of implied this, but just to make it explicit, she didn't know what they would sound like. So, and again, she was changing the nature of the rattles all the time. So there's also that kind of discovery, like you were saying, opening up the kiln. But your mention of the moon and the fact that this is looming behind us makes me think maybe we should talk about that a little more. Like, what's with the moon? The moon landing happened obviously right in the middle of her career. There's a famous story, well, famous within Takaezu circles, that she was driving home one night and she had her lights off because she was driving by the light of the full moon, and she actually got pulled over. And the officer sort of knocked on the window and he rolls it down, and he said, "Ma'am, did you know you were driving with your lights off?" And she said, "Of course I did." And he said, "Well, you're not really." And she said, "Young man, look up there. What do you see?" And he said, "The moon." And she said, "The full moon." And of course, it wasn't cloudy. And so she harangued him saying, you hardly ever get this in New Jersey. Why would I ruin this experience by turning on my electric lights, you Philistine, basically. And she eventually talked him into driving her home, like escorting. He trailed behind her until they got back to her house so she could have this experience. So anyway, the moon was a big deal for her. But I wonder what you think about the kind of spiritual, cosmic dimension of the work.
Yeah, I mean, I got to think a lot about the moon as well in the process of this, which is, and it kind of, for me, I love this story that I write about in my essay where she brought volcanic sand from Hawaii when she came to Cranbrook to integrate it into her pottery. And it goes back to her relationship to Hawaii. And then I was thinking about how the moon affects the ocean, how all of these things are interconnected. So that's what I took away from a lot of this. The spirituality of the moon was also just so embedded in nature, and that was, it also came, Leilahua's video with the tide coming in, touching the volcanic sand, and there was such an intimacy between like the ocean and the moon and the sand. So that's what I saw kind of coming through from the very beginning, through her choice of material, but also the subject of moon.
Yeah, Leilahua, who, as we've said, is from Hawaii, would often talk about what it's like to be on the beach in Hawaii and have the ocean there and maybe the sunset, and then you have a mountain right behind you, and then you have the forest line or jungle line. So you have all these different landscapes that we don't normally experience together, all compressed into one kind of psychic and physical space, and these ideas of demarcation become quite fluid and sort of effaced. And I think all of us, I wasn't actually able to go on the research trip that my colleagues took to Hawaii, but I have been there. And if you think about what it's like in Hawaii, if you've ever had the pleasure of being there, all of her work looks like Hawaiian landscape painting, really. It's so much the colors and the kind of qualities of those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, that's on a personal story too. I had gone to Hawaii, and I remember swimming in a black sand beach, and just you always moments encounter the abyss, where you just, all of a sudden, just blackness opens up to you. And I've thought about that a lot when we talk about these worlds within the. It's also about the black space kind of inside of the pot, as much as it was about the pot itself. And so I've thought about that, like my experience in Hawaii, swimming and encountering that kind of blackness and full darkness that I've never experienced anywhere else.
Yeah, exactly. That she called it the dark air, but it's almost also might think about what's inside the earth or inside the moon, and that sort of that fire that's inside the earth that we can't know, but is sort of always there, way under our feet, and ceramics is the art of earth and fire, right?
Yeah, and I think in some ways you're kind of speaking to this idea of like phenomena, right? It's like these. Glaze has that, ceramics has that quite a bit. It goes through a lot of changes, just from the time when we start from nothing to something going through these different stages of firing and things like that. And so a lot of us in ceramics do spend a lot of time really looking at like the surfaces of things and the depth of things, and getting right up to it. I've seen people take the microscopes out and put magnifying glasses on it because they want to get inside that to see it. And we talk about clay body, and people will crack the thing open and say, look, it's carbon coring or something, and we become these sort of like amateur scientists in some way. But it's but in some we're definitely looking at the phenomenon of the material a lot. And so I think there's something maybe there in that, in terms of being drawn to those things.
I don't think we mentioned, by the way, that she did make her own glazes, except when she was at Skidmore, she was using their glazes there. So the larger pots, often those are glazed with not her formula, but most of her work is she's doing that science, right, yeah. For what it's worth. I feel like we should be getting to audience questions in a second, but I wanted to just think about one other thing together, which is her onward trajectory and how we're receiving her work now. So maybe, Ian, you could talk about what you're seeing. Maybe we'll hear from some of them, but what do you feel like your students are making of this and your fellow ceramists? How is she thought about now within the tribe?
Well, that's also like a lot to take on all of a sudden in my mind. But I think we did mention just this morning this idea that ceramics itself, as a discipline, has changed quite a bit from when I was a graduate student. The idea of the craft and art debate. I love the idea you mentioned, this calling them forms, using the word directly as a form. I've often thought about the direct using of the language of studio pottery. It means something different to say it's to be a studio pottery. Being designer and producer versus just designer, as an example. So, I mean, this idea that Takaezu was really thinking through the ceramic form in many different ways. Upstairs, there's many different ways of looking at it, from plates to a vessel to the closed forms and all those things. So I think I think students now, in my experience, one thing we're always trying to think through is, the house style for Cranbrook ceramics should be no house style. There shouldn't be a house style. There should be that the students should be investigating their own interests as much as possible. And seeing an artist that has gone through so many different ways of doing that is really instructional for me as well. So is that answering your question?
Well, I think maybe there's one other thread we should draw out a little bit more, which is that question of the art-craft debate now being a kind of dead letter that we can put in a drawer and forget about.
Yeah.
And it's worth remembering that when she was working, it was constantly being brought to her doorstep.
Yeah, it was the question. I mean, many, many times in my early career, the question would be, "Why are you doing this in ceramics?" It was a very common question, and so I think, and that doesn't happen anymore. That kind of question doesn't seem to happen anymore. And I think works and artists like Takaezu are a reason that doesn't happen anymore because of that legacy and that way of approaching an object and working in many different ways.
Yeah, and what's so great about her is that she didn't give a damn about that at all. So when people would ask her, what are you? Are you a potter? Are you a sculptor or a painter? I feel like she would just look at them in this withering, like, what are you talking about? Is that really your question for me? That was sort of the feeling she would give people, and they would sort of quail. And she would then sort of dispense with the question and move on to something that was greater interest to her. Admittedly, she was very taciturn about her work and didn't say much about it and wanted to speak for itself. But she was certainly not in any way interested in that debate. And in so many respects, both in what she did care about and what she didn't care about, she seems like the illuminating exemplar and role model. But Laura, I wonder what's your take on where she sits as an influential figure, maybe beyond the ceramics world? Where do you see her influence, or where do you see the resonances in contemporary practice?
Well, as much as we are talking about within the studio conversations or crits, that not being something that is brought up, I think within our own field as curators, historians, even how things are divided with graduate school, education, museums I mentioned Olga earlier. When I was first researching Olga, I was only finding her work in Dec Art, sometimes in Latin America, and always in the Dec Art section. I think the same thing applied for someone like Toshiko, who was, museums treated like the craft discipline as its own area. Rarely did they overlap. That's changed over the last few years. We're seeing that in some of the installations you just showed us from Venice Biennale. So I think it's an exciting moment for me, because also I work in the best hybrid space for it. Like everything like craft design and art, where my career is now a blend of it, because I've been here at Cranbrook. And I don't think that's the case for encyclopedic museums. If you go to the larger museums, it's very dedicated, very rigid. So one amazing moment for me was just a couple years ago. I went to the Cleveland Museum of Art, and I saw Toshiko in the contemporary section with other abstract painting, and I saw Olga in that same contemporary presentation of the collection. So I think there's a lot of investigation, that I'm interested in about what are these disciplines, and the reason why in some ways we honor them is because there's a very specific history of that we want not to lose a specialty. There's something important about being like a specialist, and I'm not a specialist in anything. I'm all over the place, and that's good too. I think there's a way to just kind of open up even how we look at art, interpret it. And Toshiko's a great example of what happens when you crack open and not be so disciplined about it.
We have some great essays in the book about the identity politics version of this, because we were talking about the craft politics version of it. But so Laura Kina, who's again Okinawan Hawaiian, and also Margot Machida, who's a very esteemed scholar of post-war Asian American art, both talk a lot about how we might view Takaezu's work through the lens of ethnicity and immigration, immigrant populations. And I don't want to put words in their mouths, but I think you could make a comparison between the way that Takaezu works with an issue like abstraction versus utility to the way that she works with the idea of being Asian American, that hybrid identity, which is to say she doesn't adopt that identity as a banner or a source of unquestioned essential authority or a kind of place of certainty. She rather seems to explore it as a space, which is multivalent and porous, and also shifting according to the dictates of her own biography and experience. But since this is such an extremely urgent issue that's being confronted from so many different directions in the art world, I guess I wonder what you think about, both of you, what you think about this question of identity in her work and how we might learn from that. Does she seem like a kind of inspiring figure in that respect too?
I'm like, well, that's a big question. Yeah, it's a lot to take on. I mean, I think that the history of even this very brief, there's this moment that happened at Cranbrook. Toshiko comes, then several other artists from Hawaii through Claude come, and at the same time, and they kind of
Anna Kang, Alice Parrott, yeah, absolutely.
And Anna Kang's son Dana he's a really amazing choreographer. Came and did a dance and conversation, and it was really interesting to hear Dana's. Because he forefronts Asian American identity in his practice. Like that's what it was about. And so I think that as much as, you want to be careful not to put something onto the work, if that makes sense. Yeah. And it's also, I gotta tell you guys how hard it is to write books about an artist who doesn't talk about their work. And also for me in the 1950s, it was really interesting, kind of every little line I could find in a news article. But, I think at the same time, I would say almost in an aesthetic way, her dedication to the aesthetics of Hawaii, her homeland, even though this is where she comes and makes her career, there's something just about, I feel like she honors her homeland throughout her whole life and her practice. And I think in that way, I would apply that to her. And so that's my answer, which I feel like I could do a better one in 3 hours.
Yeah, give me some time. But I think in some ways, I think a little bit about craft traditions themselves and where they come from. Mm-hmm. So I've spent some time myself in Japan, but I was raised in the U.S. and so the traditions that I was raised in terms of craft traditions or ceramics traditions, and so if you think about from Hawaii or from Japan, Okinawa to Hawaii to the Midwest here, to New Jersey. These all can also influence, in terms of what kind of traditions are coming from those particular places. And also, in some ways, again, to repeat myself, in some ways, at the time, I think now things are changing. We think about this a lot in the current ceramic moment is what materials are available, period. We were just in the middle just a few days ago of learning about different materials that are no longer available to us. They're being essentially mined out of the earth. And so what materials you might have access to would also influence the work you're making based on the geography, which would also be part of your identity, is that particular geography. Yeah. So particular clays that come from Hawaii might actually, if you think about porcelain's always the example, but if you think about different clay bodies that come from different places, that also could be very much part of, a direct correlation to identity. And
well, this is maybe a good place for us to stop because it just highlights what a complex thinker she is, even if she's not necessarily articulating it. She's expressing it through her work, or articulating it in that way. But you think about so many aspects of her work that aspire to or achieve and manifest a certain universality. So her mastery of materials, which of course is exterior to humanity, what can clay actually do? There's this kind of scientific facticity to that. abstraction, obviously. This is a long history of being associated with at least an aspiration to cross-cultural universality. So there's lots of ways in which she's part of this modernist dream of a transcendent form that's equally relevant to everyone, and yet at the same time, she cares so deeply about her own family, her heritage, the conditions of place, the conditions of specific craft knowledge and where that knowledge comes from, and she pays deep respect to that. She has these figures like Tawny around her that become pole stars for her. So she seems to be able to maintain that universality and that contrary specificity at the same time, and to kind of put them together in this way that produces all of this energy. And to get back to our earlier comments with which we began, that sense of doing everything that humans can do all at once and committing fully to that, and the way that she was able to exemplify that, it just makes her so, like, you can just feel like you can keep learning from her forever, I mean, you don't do 100,000 word book about an artist and feel like you're just scratching the surface very often, but that's really how I feel with her. She just seems like, every generation will have their own Toshiko Takaezu, and this is the one we have, but I'm sure people will keep learning from her, probably including some people in the audience. So we should probably start taking questions, right, Lila?
Yeah. As your hands go up wildly, because I know that there's lots of questions after this wonderful conversation, I do just want to plug, because it was in Glenn's talk, that in 2 weeks on the 23rd, Prudence Pfeiffer will be here to talk about The Slip with Nihaved Pathak, who
great.
also has a show upstairs, who's here with us today. But I just want to mention that if you'd like to think more about Agnes Martin and abstraction and the work of women artists, we'll be having a really, really wonderful conversation about that in 2 weeks. So please do join us again. And now it's time for me to see those hands. Anyone? Shall we? Who would like to start? We'll take 3 or 4. Okay, we'll come right down here.
I just have a comment about...
One moment. We'd love to get a recording.
Thank you. Oh, okay. This show is so beautifully astrologically and also anthropologically clear about who she was, how she developed, her passion, the way she moved forward a little at a time, smaller pieces, more inventive pieces, more brave pieces where she was experimenting. And the show shows larger and larger and more braver and more intensely inventive pieces as it goes along. And it was like at the very end, you walk in that room, I have to say, I caught my breath at the last room with the huge pieces and this picture. And you realize this was her battle with eternity, damn it. And she was going to show you who she was. So that's what I want to say about that.
Wow, okay. Yeah.
Thank you, yes.
So clearly Barbara should have been up on the stage with us, but so just so everyone knows, this is Barbara Tover, who is Chair Emerita of the Museum of Arts and Design, among many other things, and knew Takaezu very, very well for many years, so you know whereof you speak. But thank you, Barbara. That was wonderful. Other questions?
I'm coming for the ceramics department students that I recognize here, so please ready yourselves. I'm
You
on
know
my way.
who you are.
Thank you. I knew I could count on you.
Hi. I noted that you mentioned Helen Frankenthaler quite a bit during your talk, and I thought it was really interesting, like, having you dive more into her biography and, like, these relationships that she had with other artists. And, like, now I feel like we do kind of accept her within the canon of abstract expressionism, in a sense. And I'm curious about, like, if she actually had a lot of engagement with, like, painting and other abstract painters at the time, and maybe what that looked like for her.
Yeah, super question. Do you want to talk about that in the Cranbrook phase? Okay. Well, just to say, there was a lot of abstract expressionist painting happening at Cranbrook when she was here. And Joe Burgess, who was, as I said, she didn't get married and she didn't have a long-term romantic relationship that we know of later in life, but Joe Burgess was like the last person that she considered. And he was an abstract expressionist who had a lot of experience in New York, and she had a very lively correspondence with him. He ultimately, in fact, married Anna Kang, who was another Cranbrook student, and she seems to have gotten a lot from that specific relationship. Also, we know that she went to galleries and museums in New York a lot, especially once she got to New Jersey. So she would drive in, sometimes with her apprentices who would talk about this. And so she was paying very close attention. She, as we've been saying, she wasn't very voluble on any topic, and this was one that she very rarely talked about at all. But we have a sense of her being quite oriented to the color field painting of the 1960s and 70s particularly, which is when she would have arrived on the East Coast. It might be worth saying that Frankenthaler is a particularly good example, partly because of the way that she thinks about staining and the kind of saturation of materials, which is very similar to the way that glaze, Ian, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's very similar to the way that glaze will interact with a matte ceramic surface once it's bisque fired, for example. And it's also just interesting to note that the Everson Museum did quite an important show in 1975 where they invited artists like Jules Olitsky and Larry Poons and Frankenthaler to work in clay, and that was kind of a big deal at the time. So there was more of a back and forth between the media then than we might expect, because we're sort of all hardwired to think, oh, the fine artists and the craftspeople were like in these opposite camps, like linebackers across the line of scrimmage. But that's not actually true until the 80s, actually, when the craft movement starts to kind of coalesce and achieve its own kind of escape velocity, in my view. And so actually for a lot of Takaezu's career in practice, there would have been a lot of movement back and forth. Also the May shows in Cleveland, she would have been shown right alongside abstract painters, not necessarily abstract expressionists, but there's lots of ways where you can see the communication going back and forth.
I think it would be interesting too to think about, as you asked the question earlier, where Takaezu is in the current contemporary moment, whether painters now are looking back at the ceramics versus Takaezu looking towards painting, whether now that's being something that painters might be looking. And I think you do see a lot more painters now actively looking towards ceramics as a way to try to express a different.
And making ceramics too,
Correct.
sterling, ruby, et cetera. So a lot of people moving back and forth, yeah. This idea that clay is basically three-dimensional paint, which of course it isn't, and when people really think that, they make terrible work. But there is a very powerful conversation to be had between the two media, and Takaezu was obviously doing that, and you're seeing more and more people doing that now. Volkas, of course, made paintings as well, for what it's worth.
Thank you so much for this history tonight, and thank you to the panel as well. I have a question about how much she wrote about her own work, what that looked like. And I know, Laura, you said that she didn't really speak. I wonder if this is a reflection on the record or a lack of a record coming directly from her. And maybe this is a kind of two-part question, because I'm interested how we might think about what she's left inside of her rattles. You mentioned that they might be words written on there, maybe poems. Where does that come from? How do we get into that secret world?
Yeah, so, well, the short answer is that she didn't write about her work. When she absolutely had to, she would submit to an interview, and she would generally say the same thing over and over again. When she got happy with that, like the dark airline, she would just say it over and over again, year after year, almost like a defense mechanism as much as an explanation. And so we can speculate on why that would be. It does seem to me that there's a kind of period sensibility at work there. And in fact, one way that she is very akin to the abstract expressionists is that they were also quite hostile to the idea of explication and self-theorization, very much unlike the generation that comes along in the 1960s. So think about Donald Judd or Robert Morris, for example, and their kind of almost like psychotic overinterpretation of these very mute artworks. And in the 50s, which is when Takaezu comes of age, it's exactly the other way around. It's supposed to be the, there's supposed to be a fullness and a kind of ineffability to the work. And if you have to explain it, then something's deeply wrong. And I think that's the point of view that she comes out of, as well as perhaps just having a personal disposition that inclines towards being quiet and demonstrating through action rather than words. That's kind of just who she is. So all that said, she does have a very interesting relationship to language. And one thing that I didn't say is that when she goes to Japan, one of the things that she wants to do, and has kind of on a pilgrimage in this respect, is to find the work of this 19th century Japanese nun and ceramic artist who is called Otagaki Rengetsu. And she wrote poetry on the outside of her ceramics. And Takaezu was determined to find one of these. And she actually did, apparently. This is something she did tell an interviewer. And she found it in an antique shop, and she held it in her hands, and she couldn't come close to affording it. But having simply encountered it was enough for her. And when she went home, that it seems to be when she started to inscribe. We had a couple of very early pieces that she actually did write poetry on the outside of, which she only did for a very brief moment, and we think that might have influenced her decision to inscribe the inside of her pots. So this idea of the object as a poetic construct and the relationship between, at any rate, Japanese verse and ceramics is clearly very active in her mind. But you know what Japanese poetry is often like, right? It's like all about the white space, just like the painting is like haiku, right? It's about this very deft, specific piece of language that creates a world around it. So that's actually very compatible with her general reticence, I would say.
Yeah, I'll just, the process of, I'm really a contemporary curator, like, even though I keep, whatever, I don't know who I am anymore, but I've been here for like a decade. But, so going and doing like a historical essay about the 1950s where you have very little content was like very interesting to me. Yeah, it's interesting. Every little sentence I could find, usually in like some newspaper clippings, I would like hold on to. Like she mentioned she had like gone to Detroit, and the big thing that happened to her too when she moved here was like she got to go to museums. So she went to the Detroit Institute of Art. That's where she learned about Paul Klee. Like I hung on to that so hard, and I was like, well, let me make that comparison, So you start holding on to the few things they do say to give you a pathway, because you also want to be genuine. So there's always that little bit of a struggle. But a funny story that I liked is when I actually conceived of the schedule of the show, I did not really think through the fact that we were also going to have some Agnes Martins with Niha's work right next to Toshiko Takaezu and the Lenore Tawney. Lenore Tawney and Agnes Martin were in a relationship with each other for a few years, remained lifelong friends. So I was like, Lenore Tawney. And so I reached out to Glenn and I said, Glenn, did Toshiko know Agnes Martin? Like, it seems like they would be in the same. And he's like, I don't know, but if they did, they probably just nodded at each other. I think that kind of sums up, yeah.
And by the way, for what it's worth, Tawny and Martin, so we know that Martin was gay. Tawny, it's really hard to say what was going on there. She's certainly not known to have had any other female partners, and whether she had anything but an intellectual relationship with Martin is quite hard to determine, and I'm not sure they would want us to even talk about it. But what I know they did do was get on the phone late at night, even though they lived in the same building, and read Meister Eckhart, the medieval mystic, to one another on the telephone. So that's how they like to spend their time, and they would talk about the East River flowing outside their window. Right, so that's what their relationship was about. Which I don't know about you, but I feel like that might be a condition to aspire to. At least in part.
It's 7:57. The museum closes at 8, but we're going to take 2 more questions anyways. They're just here, so please.
Special dispensation.
Yeah. Did she investigate the raku process at all?
I'm not sure I've seen anything of hers that's raku fired. That was, of course, a big phenomenon in the 1970s and very associated with the West Coast scene initially, like Paul Soldner, and getting these kind of raku parties happening. She did investigate a lot of, we haven't talked about this, which we should have done, but she did investigate a lot of firing techniques, of which the most important, apart from her usual gas-fired kiln, would be wood firing, which she did at Peters Valley, especially, but also other places, including in Shigaraki in Japan on a residency. So that's where you actually have the flame marks on the surface of the stoneware, usually, stoneware body. And often you wouldn't use glaze, or you would only have a natural ashfall glaze on the surface. So she investigated that. And she also did salt firing. There's good examples of that, which is where you get that kind of orange peel, kind of pebbly surface. But I can't think of anything I've seen of hers that's raku fired. She did also work in porcelain, by the way. You mentioned that's a very, in some ways, surprising thing, but she would work at pretty large scale in porcelain and throw in that, and sometimes even wood fire porcelain. So she was very interested in that range of what you can do in terms of the kiln, in terms of the palette. Anything you want to add to that, Ian, from looking at the, yeah?
Alrighty. Brief question, but maybe like 3 years ago now, I had taken a tour through your guys' archival library, and we came across the kind of ceramics portion, and I believe I did see some of Toshiko's work from what I think I remember, and I remember seeing a photo that you had put. I've yet to take a look at the exhibit, but of a piece of hers, and I was like, I think I've seen that before. So I must have seen it at that point, but I remember the tour guide had mentioned something about the vessel opening on the top, of like theoretically how it could, you could place a piece of a blade of grass or like a cat's whisker or something like that, and it was like that small. So I didn't hear anything said. I remember that like small fact just like sticking with me of what the tour guide had said, and I was wondering if that probably was in fact some of Toshiko's work that I saw, or like is that something that you found in your research of like was a piece of what you had found?
And we always, when we give that tour, we talk about fitting in a blade of grass at the very top. But yes, you were looking, absolutely. Toshiko gave Cranbrook a lot of work before she passed away. And actually, I'm going to ask Greg Wakop. I end my essay with this story because he was the one with Toshiko when they made the selections. It's a great way, I think, to end the talk. Greg, will you tell the story about how we got our large early spring?
I'm coming.
And Early Spring is one of the big works in the last gallery, along with the Star series, so you can see it upstairs.
Well, as she was beginning to disperse her work to museums around the nation, there were, about 5 of the institutions that were on her immediate first list. And so Gerhard Nodal and I had the pleasure of going out to her studio in New Jersey and arrived there early in the morning. She fed us breakfast and then just kind of told us, head out. In her complex was quite vast, many different buildings, and start roaming around. There's a table here. Start bringing to the table the pieces you're interested in. And Gerhard and I are kind of looking at each other and thinking, oh my God, we've got to do this right. Do we just pick 3? Do we, 30? What's, and how ambitious are we in, what we choose? So,
and Greg, how many pieces were there in the house at that point?
Oh, there were hundreds.
Yeah.
There were hundreds. I mean, there were a lot. And so we spent like 2-3 hours, making this careful selection. I think we decided we won't go over 10, so it was going to be like 9 because that just seemed like it would be accepting of this opportunity but not being greedy. So I remember, the key moment was she went away, while we were doing this, and there we were proudly standing next to 9-ish objects that we had picked, and she simply turned to us and said, "Not bad, boys, but you missed a few." And that's when then she started leading us to the very large forms. In fact, one of them we had to drive to a location about a half an hour away because she wanted to see, wanted us to have one particular one. That was part of that, yeah. The question that I've been curious about, and I never had a chance to ask her this, or I never really thought about it, but picking up on the notion of, kind of the process, the chance of process, but also the seriality of form. Do we know, did she do any self-editing, or did she accept, what the kiln gave her?
Okay, so this is a great opportunity to mention her teaching practice, which involves smashing students' work without asking permission. Ian, just saying. And also she would stalk around when a student showed the work. She would stalk around the table not saying anything, dead silence in the room. And we were just waiting. What is she going to say? What is she going to say? Of course, the student, Brooke Shields or whoever, is shaking, right? And she would say something like, if you're going to make it so ugly, don't make it so big. Or someone, that's a real example, or a kindred. Anyway, to answer your question, yeah, she subjected herself to the same brutal treatment, and she would smash pots all the time, and there's an incredible kind of archaeological site behind her house in New Jersey that's got those shards. Yeah, so she was very demanding of herself, which is typical of ceramic artists, I think, actually. There's a lot of wastage. But, she was tough on everybody, but maybe toughest on herself, which is true of a lot of great artists, I think. Do you mind if I just say one last thing, which is just a kind of round of thank yous? Because Layla, I think you're about to draw us to a close. So I just want to say that there's a lot of people that made this happen. I do want to mention one very special person who's Peter Russo, who is an incredible collector of Takaezu's work and has worked with the foundation board. And also did a lot of the fundraising for the project, so he really deserves a shout out. The foundation board itself, which is actually led by Darlene Fukuji, who's her grandniece, Takaezu's grandniece, who's a real young dynamo who's making this happen. And then above all, I just want to thank the people here at Cranbrook again. So Laura, especially as curator, Andrew, Lila, the whole team. But it's just been an incredible thing to see this show transmogrify and land here with such elegance and grace and perfection. And I'm sure Takaezu would have been very, she would have said, yeah, good job. Just like she did with Greg all those years ago.
So since DeSalle Auditorium is actually Cranbrook's world within, I'd like to invite us to all be the rattle with an insane round of applause that can be heard up with someone walking across the plaza right now to close this evening.